in a world where you can do anything, a world where everything is possible beyond your imagination, with magic, old wise wizards, prophecies that spoil the entire book, creatures that will talk in puzzles and won't help shit, existing battles with swords and dragons, or the second main character just dies for the plot, and adventures and quests. So actually the best thing out there to escape this world. This video is for aspiring fantasy writers or just people who love talking about fantasy and can never hear enough details on it, or people who just want to see me act out weird tropes. There's a lot we're going to talk about in this playlist. I want you to be able to just watch this entire playlist and then know everything you need to know. Personally, the fantasy world is really special to me. Like, fantasy is my favorite book genre, and I think most of my life, like most of the things I've read are fantasy. And I also write fantasy. Obviously, it's the most easiest for me to write since I've read so much. So yeah, this is, I think, the video where I can add the most of my own tips into the kind of writing and world-building stuff, because I have more experience with it as well. And so yeah, let's start. What is fantasy about? What is considered fantasy? What are the key elements? In general, I think fantasy is one of the most superior genres, especially because it's my favorite genre, but it just allows for anything to happen. And in my opinion, this is kind of the best way of escapism. We can compare it to the horror and sci-fi genre because they're also considered speculative fiction, which I haven't really thought about it before, but it does make sense. I mean, horror and sci-fi is also a lot of fictional stuff in there, and both are usually based on imaginary, unrealistic, and fictional ideas. What are you talking about? I thought everything was real, and fairies were definitely not invented by two girls that took pictures in the woods. Excuse me? But here's where the differences lie. So whilst fantasy can contain scientific and macabre elements, it doesn't really rely on having to be coherent with real science, real history and nature, which is why it's kind of superior, especially when it comes to escapism and immersion, because you can just kind of do what you want. The settings can be in the real world or contain real world elements, or be in a completely made up world with its own laws and its own logic. And they can also take place at any time. But it usually involves some kind of magical or supernatural elements that do not exist in our real world, like myth, legends, creatures, objects, or sorcerers. So we usually associate this with castles, dragons, knights, quests, swords, fights. So this is usually what comes up in my mind when I think about fantasy. So then I started to wonder, how much is enough? What do you need in your story for it to be considered fantasy? It should include some kind of magical or supernatural elements, and they have to be a part of the main story, the theme, or the entire setting. You can't just put one dragon in one sentence and be done deal, fantasy genre. I mean, who would do that? It wouldn't make any sense. And there's a lot of discourse on how magic should be, how it should not be, how much it needs to be a part of your world, how much it needs to be that, how it can't be your entire plot solver. There's so much discussions on that, but I think what we're forgetting is that fantasy is about getting immersed and drawn into this world, and for this you also have to kind of lay down and suspend your disbeliefs and accept the impossible. So why are you reading fantasy if you can't be drawn in by the magic of it? But I agree that there has to be some kind of logic behind it, so you're not constantly wait a second, how does that make sense? You know what I mean? Okay, so now that we know what fantasy actually is, let's talk about the different subgenres of it, because there are more than 50 subgenres, which is wild. I will go through the main ones, but if you're interested in a specific one, I can do other videos on it where I go into depth with them. But yeah, we will be here next week if I go through every single subgenre. But I think it's always good to look at what's out there, because then you can understand what you like to read, and it's easier to find more books like that. But it also helps with writing, because sometimes when I did this research, I found so many things I didn't know about. So I'm like, now I have so much inspiration of what like my next book could be. So let's take a look at dystopian fantasy, high fantasy, low fantasy, dark fantasy, and finally fairy tales and fables. So, dystopian fantasy is about worlds that have gone wrong and that are presented worse than the present world, which honestly, is that even possible? Like, I feel like our entire world is literally dystopian. But it's also about thought provoking takes by invoking systemic problems, but also adding like stark relief. And a lot of dystopian fantasy is science fiction, so it was kind of difficult to find more info on this because there are a lot of science fiction elements in this. But in general, it's like, yeah, about a world that is kind of wrong in a certain sense. And grimdark fantasy is actually a further like specification that contains a lot of dystopian elements. And grimdark fantasy is often like immoral or violent, and the writing tends to be a little bit more realistic. And this is pretty cool because here the line between hero and villain is more blurred. Like, you don't have a black and white good and bad. It's about characters who battle environmental ruin, about technological control and government oppressions, and it often takes a look into the future. So this is kind of what makes up this genre. But another interesting example, I thought, in general, like the entire Harry Potter world, it doesn't really like, dystopian is not the first thing that comes to mind, but when we actually take a look at the elements of what makes up a dystopian world, there are a lot of elements in the Harry Potter series, like the repressive Ministry of Magic, the totalitarian rule of Voldemort, the slavery of the house elves, the prejudice between races, and the cruel and unusual punishment and the government bureaucracy that hinders more than it kind of helps. So I think that was really interesting because I like, now that this Reddit poster said this, like, it does make sense to me. And I also found this magazine website that created a great list of books. So if you're interested in this genre, if you're like, that sounds like something I would like to read, or something I would like to write about, then I definitely suggest looking through this list they made and kind of picking something that piques your interest. One particular one that stood out to me was The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I also read Babel from her, or listened to the audiobook, and I really loved it. So I think that's something I can recommend from the same author at least. And it, on the one hand, contains these dark themes, like the story deals with heavy themes like war, vengeance, and the potential loss of humanity, which are essential to this grimdark dystopian fantasy. It's also in a brutal world. The setting is really harsh, wherein one of the characters faces discrimination, poverty, and the looming threat of a devastating war, all of which contribute to this grim and oppressive atmosphere. There's also the anti-hero protagonist. So Rin, the character herself, can be considered as an anti-hero as her actions are driven by necessity and survival, which may lead her down a darker path, especially as she grapples with the violent and destructive aspects of her powers. Don't want to spoil anything, so that's what it's about. Then I wanted to take a look at The Court of Broken Knives by Anna Smith Park. She also has these elements of moral ambiguity. There is this mission to assassinate the emperor in the palace, which raises ethical questions and suggests a world where morality is comprised for a perceived greater good, which are typical grimdark narratives. There's also a lot of decadence and corruption. The city where it plays is depicted as lost to decadence, to decay, where the true rulers are like greed and blindness, which subsequently leads to the empire's vulnerability, which is also a common grimdark theme. And lastly, it also has this dark and oppressive atmosphere. It's set in a world where the empire's wealth contrasts sharply with the violence and destruction, which kind of creates this bleak, foreboding atmosphere. So I think these sounded really good. Like, I will definitely have a look at those. I'm not the biggest fan of these kind of settings, but I think raising these moral questions is really interesting, so I will definitely take a look in that genre. Then let's move on to the next one. I found out this is kind of the genre I love the most, which is high fantasy. It's also called epic fantasy. So a big part of this high fantasy is that you have your own constructed world. You make your own rules, you make your own physical laws. And the cool part about this is you can make it up yourself. You can construct it in the way you want to, but you can still make up like cool rules that can add so much interesting stories into your book. Usually it's like a secondary world, non-earth, including animals, plants, cultures, belief systems. The average common book has like a high-stake conflict, and the plots usually revolve around one single hero or like a band of heroes. There's often like historic or unusual tech, and obviously includes magic. Here's a list of books. I think I've read every single one of these. I mean, Hobbit, it's The Lord of the Rings, it's like the classics. Tell me if you want me to explain what a book is about every time, even though it seems like everyone would kind of know it. Anyways, so if we take a look at Hobbit and The Lord of Rings and kind of look at our checklist of what makes high fantasy, it makes sense that it is classified as this. There is a secondary world. I mean, just look at the map and look at the aesthetic. Look at the orcs, the elves, the ents, everything. Then we have the high-stake conflict. They have to get rid of the ring, literally, to stop Sauron from taking over the world. It revolves around Frodo and the Fellowship. So we have this hero group. There are swords. Then they also like write letters, which is also this historic element. It's very medievally. There's also magic. We have like Gandalf. We have the sword that glows when the orcs are around. Literally the ring. Literally the ring. Then we also have Six of Crows, which I can also highly recommend. I love that book. She completely created a new world. There are different cities, different cultures, the way their relationships are, the internal problems. Then we have these Grishas, which have magical powers. Then we have racism within these cultures she created, which actually really interesting, were inspired by a Russian imperial atlas. Like she looked at imperial atlases and then created her, used it to inspire her world. Then in this book specifically, they go on a heist where each character has their own intentions and stalks. And yeah, again, we have this group of heroes that it revolves around. Then we have this medieval tech status. It's a little bit more advanced than like the usual European medieval type fantasy stories. And yeah, literally we have magic in there. So this definitely I'm just doing this to give you a better understanding of like what high fantasy means and like what kind of makes up these things. Then let's move on to low fantasy. Low fantasy is usually set in the real world or a primary world which is very similar to it. It's about unexpected, magical, or supernatural elements that surprise ordinary characters. So kind of like, oh, here's a magical amulet in Berlin. I don't know. There are more character-driven personal stakes, like not world stakes, like in The Lord of the Ring, but more like personal stake. It also incorporates subgenres like magical realism, urban fantasy, historical fantasy, dystopian fiction, and most dark fantasy or horror fantasy. It often includes like werewolves, mermaids, like the classical magical creatures we know. Here's another list of low fantasy. With Harry Potter, I'm a little bit confused because it is kind of a world stake. But other than that, if we take a look at the other elements, Harry Potter is set in the real world, it's set in the UK. We have technological advancements and the history is realistic, like from the Muggle side. And then we also have these unrealistic magical tech and magical history when we look at like the Hogwarts side. We have wands, potions, they have their own ministry, their own laws. We have these weird werewolves in there. And yeah, so we have a lot of these elements we just talked about that make up low fantasy. But yeah, I feel like it doesn't really fit the whole personal driven stakes. But for that, I wanted to make an example that fits it more in my opinion, which is Twilight, where it is more about like personal stakes, just so you can get a sense of what is kind of meant by that. Moving on to dark fantasy, it combines the horror genre with the fantasy genre. It creates this more unnerving feeling. It often has a paranormal setting and supernatural elements. And there are often characters that are anti-heroes or morally grey. And happy endings aren't really a guarantee, which honestly I feel like nowadays happy endings aren't that much of a guarantee in most of the things, because it has just gotten too boring to always have a good ending. The stories can be often told from a monster's point of view, and in general there are grim elements like less hope and less capacity for change. Really popular ones are Edgar Allan Poe. I think that's like a name everyone has kind of heard. Then H.P. Lovecraft, Dracula, and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Here we have a bigger list. Of course, Stephen King is represented here. I think Coraline is such a perfect fit into this genre. It is very unnerving. We have this. I highly recommend reading the book, highly recommend watching the movie, highly recommend watching every single theory video that's out there on YouTube, because they are great. Like I will look for a person that I really love watching, that she made great videos about Coraline. Like I didn't, it was creepy when I watched it as a kid. I don't know how it is for 6-year-olds, but as I grew older, I kind of developed, I feel like everyone has developed a kind of weird obsession with Coraline. Anyways, so to understand how it plays into this genre, we have this tunnel that she goes through that leads to a different world with also like a different mother. So she has like the other mother. So these are these like paranormal settings. So everything seems the same at first, but then the more the story unravels, the more gruesome details like reveal themselves. We also have these grim elements. Everything is like more gray, also in the real world, and then later in this other world. And towards the end, this also doesn't really change. Like the boringness, like the raininess, it doesn't really change, but Coraline like sees it from a different perspective. Like this whole adventure has given her like a different point of view on everything. So it seems kind of better, but we're still left to the point where we're like, okay, is this other world still there? Which is kind of also this part of this element we talked about, like this hopelessness, less capacity for change. And yeah, I think it fits perfectly in there. Another example is Game of Thrones. Definitely agree with that. I mean, we have, as for the magical elements, we have these White Walkers, we have dragons, literally, we have blood magic, and I think a big part, if you just watch the first season, like there are no happy endings guaranteed, literally, with the amount of people that just die with a snap of a finger. Like you cannot get attached to any character. We also have this violent atmosphere. We have really complex personalities. It still has a very like realistic touch on it. Yeah, everyone can die. We have old man, we have like average man and woman, and I think it also definitely fits into this grim darkness. Moving on to fairy tales. Yeah, this is just the general genre of a magical story, which usually originates in folklore. Typically in European fairy tales, we have like a poor person, we have a brave person, a resourceful hero or heroine that goes through testing adventures to eventually reach good fortune. And generically, for any traditional oral narrative, we have these myths, we have legends, we have anecdotes. A fable, I kind of like included this in there because it's very similar to a fairy tale, but it also includes animals or inanimate objects that are given the mentality and speech of human beings to point out some type of moral. Like the moral thing is a big part of this whole fairy tale thing. I mean, if we take a look at the Beauty of the Beast, where like the teapots can talk, that is what is meant by that. Most popular ones are also like Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, like the classic ones that are like told to us or read to us, where like we have this Disney version that is like really good, and then we also have like the Brothers Grimm, which is much more gruesome, which the person that does the Coraline videos also has a lot of cool videos on the real tales. Okay, so now you want to write fairy tales, you're interested in this. What elements should your story contain? Usually they are set in the past. There are fantasy or supernatural and make-believe aspects. We have kind of like a clear good and evil. We have magical elements like people, objects, or events. Usually there's a problem or a conflict that needs to be solved, and usually we have these like happy endings and they lived forever. And they should kind of teach a lesson or demonstrate certain values. And also, interesting part, we have this kind of like repetition stuff, for example, with Rumpelstiltskin. But yeah, again, these are just kind of what makes up most of the fairy tales, which doesn't mean you can go outside of the norm. It's just to give you like a sense of what kind of makes fairy tales fairy tales. But I think it's always like, I love it. I love it when people like go outside of these norms and make it really unique. So these are like the main subgenres I wanted to take a look at. I hope this kind of gave you a better sense and understanding of what the fantasy genres are like about and what makes each of those unique, or what elements make up each of these subgenres, and kind of hope to help you understand, okay, what genres could I maybe like, or what genres am I more familiar with and feel more comfortable with writing. And yeah, and so this kind of like just lays the groundwork so you understand, okay, what is fantasy about, what the kind of subgenres are. I think we've learned really interesting things. What is your favorite subgenre in fantasy, or what is your favorite book in fantasy? I would really be interested in to know. And also please write a short description, because honestly there's nothing better than having a person hype up a book and like say why. If you tell me I loved The Leaf by January and I couldn't put it away and cried 10 days after it, I'm like, give it to me. If you want me to cover certain subgenres, then tell me, and yeah, I will do that. So if you have anything interesting to say about this topic, please write in the comments. Let's be respectful and kind and have really cool discussions and really cool recommendations. I'm really excited. So yeah, if you want to and you enjoyed this video, please like it, and yeah, subscribe me if you don't want to miss out on any of the videos on this fantasy book genre deep dive. I don't have anything more to say. So see you next time. Bye.